I thought I'd round up the Gamma Society's Gibbons contributions to the year. You can't fail to pass through notice that we've been celebrating Gibbons because it's 400 years since his death, and I'll end up with saying something about centenaries. But I thought, I'm not going to particularly talk about his music for viols, but put the viol music into the context of his career. Because I'm always interested when coaching concerts and so on, that people very often ask me questions about, well, what was Gibbons doing, or whoever the composer might be. Can you tell us something about the composer? Most of this you could have found out for yourselves, but I've tried to condense what's known about Gibbons into the next little time. Gibbons is one of the early music composers whose music never really went out of fashion, or at least some of it didn't go out of fashion. For some composers, their music wasn't performed for hundreds of years and had to be reinvented, refound, re-edited, brought to life again. Gibbons' music, at least some of it, has always been in performance, particularly some of the Anglican church music. I've got the first example. His little four-part motet, or anthem rather, Almighty and Everlasting God, has never dropped out of circulation. The earliest surviving source is from about the 1620s, within Gibbons' lifetime, from manuscript part books in Durham Cathedral's library. It was published in 1641, a few years after his death, in Barnard's first book of selected church music. It was then recopied in manuscripts in the late 17th century and into the early 18th century. It was republished by William Boyce in Cathedral Music in the 18th century, 1768, and it was republished in the Church Anthem book edited by Walford Davis in 1933. So you can trace the history of this piece being performed right the way through from Gibbons' own lifetime, and you can perhaps see why, or hear why, because it's quite straightforward. It's in four parts. Mostly it's in imitation, in very nicely written imitation, with some places in homophony. The words are very clear, and it just all makes sense. That was the choir of Manchester Cathedral. I'm sorry, because of the lack of blackout, these aren't easy to read perhaps, but the Gibbons were a musical family. Orlando came from musical stock. His father, William, was a wait, one of the town musicians. In fact, he was the head wait, not head waiter, the head wait of Cambridge Waits. He was in charge of 5 waits. He had the responsibility of looking after their gold badges and giving them out to the players and retrieving them at the end of their various ceremonial functions. He moved, he started doing that in 1566 in Cambridge, and then in 1580 he moved to the other university city and became head of the Waits in Oxford. and it's in Oxford that Orlando was born. And then later again, he went back to Cambridge. So between the two university cities, William Gibbons took his family backwards and forwards from one to the other. William married Mary, and they had 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls, and all 4 boys became professional musicians in one way or another, a bit like the Bach family. If you were a Bach, you were a musician. If you were a Gibbons, you became a musician. So the eldest brother of Orlando was Edward, who was quite a lot older than him, born in 1568, so what's that, 68, 78, 17 years older than Orlando. He became Master of the Choristers at King's in Cambridge from 1592, so in the 1590s that's where he was, and then moved to Exeter Cathedral, where he became teacher of the choristers, and he held that post right through until the Civil War, also adding the role of Ssenter at Exeter. Ellis Gibbons, another older brother, we don't know anything about his life or his career, but he did contribute 2 madrigals to the Triumphs of Oriana, published by Thomas Morley in 1601, which brought together many of the leading composers. So Morley obviously considered him to be worthy of sitting alongside the other English composers of his time. Ferdinando, Orlando's next brother in age, a couple of years older, followed his father's profession of becoming a wait, a town musician, and is recorded in 1611 in Lincoln. And then Orlando, the youngest son, born in 1583, and initially studied with his older brother Edward at King's in Cambridge. He was quite a boy chorister in the 1590s, mid-1590s. Certainly he's recorded it at King's from 1596 to 1599, after which he rather dropped out of the records. We don't know quite what Orlando Gibbons was doing after 1599 and for about 4 years. Gibbons was born in Oxford. He was christened on Christmas Day, or baptised rather, on Christmas Day in St Martin's, Oxford, which no longer exists, apart from its tower, which you may know as Carfax Tower. That's the tower. And St Martin's was the civic church in Oxford. It's where the mayor and the councillors worshipped, and so William Gibbons, obviously, as one of the town musicians, was closely associated with it, and that's where Orlando was baptised in 1583. King's is where he studied, certainly as a chorister, and possibly staying on when his voice broke, and working as a copyist, and possibly singing with his adult male voice for a year or 2, but that's not been documented. So there were also 4 girls, none of whom is noted in musical documentation, but that's quite typical of females. They may well have been musicians as well, but not working professionally. He next crops up in the Chapel Royal. So had he been in London from 1599 to 1603 when his signature first crops up in the checkbook of the Chapel Royal, that's the book of the Chapel Royal, it may well have been that he'd been privately apprenticed to one of the gentlemen of the Chapel Royal, one of the keyboard players in particular, and may have been depping in services, may have been working as what was known as an extraordinary gentleman, i.e. one that wasn't paid, who would deputise and learn the trade, waiting for a post to become vacant. This was 1603 was when King James I, of course, took over the throne, uniting Scotland and England following the death of Queen Elizabeth. The Chapel Royal wasn't a place, it was the group of musicians who worked for the king wherever the king happened to be in providing music for the liturgy. Many of the surviving chapels royal from the palaces no longer exist from that time. Hampton Court does, and if you know that chapel, you can imagine the size of it, which is not big, and the extravagance of the decoration, which was matched by the liturgy and the music in many cases in its elaboration. So we've got Gibbons turning up in the Chapel Royal in 1603, and he had to wait for someone to die before he could get a permanent post. And luckily for him, in 1605, one of the organists, Arthur Cock, died, and Gibbons was sworn in his place. Arthur Cock has left us one piece of music which is a rather nice 5-part in nominee. If you haven't played Cox in nominee, search it out. It is published by the Gavin Society in one of those 5 in nominees or whatever it is publications. I suspect that Gibbons may well have apprenticed himself to Cock as an organist and worked with him and learned the ropes of being an organist in the Chapel Royal from Arthur Cock. Arthur Cock was known to the Gibbons family because he started, before he went to the Chapel Royal, he had been organist at Canterbury Cathedral, and then guess where? He worked at Exeter Cathedral, where Edward, oldest brother, was working. So the oldest brother of Orlando and Arthur Cock, who was then appointed to the Chapel Royal, knew each other and worked together. I can imagine Edward saying to Arthur, "Can you look after me young brother for a bit and show him the ropes?" There's a lot of nepotism went on in royal appointments. So in 1605, Gibbons joins the Chapel Royal as probably, although the post didn't exist as such, the junior organist. There were 3 organists at that time. Senior organist was John Bull, the second organist was Edmund Hooper, and Gibbons sort of being the 3rd organist. And they'd have taken it in terms of playing in services or in elaborate occasions where there may have been need for more than one organ, they would have shared the role. It was quite a good time to be a member of the Chapel Royal. When James came to the throne, one of the things he did quite early on in his reign was to raise the stipends of the gentlemen of the Chapel Royal from £30 a year to £40 a year. Quite a nice increase. It wasn't quite so nice to be around in 1605 when the gunpowder plot may have blown the whole lot up. But luckily it was defeated, and so the Chapel Royal and the royal family survived. Certainly by 1605, Gibbons was feeling well enough established to get married, and he marries the daughter of one of the yeomen of the Chapel Royal. So he's very much in this little circle of royal service. The yeoman of the Chapel Royal was the sort of chief verger, basically, who looked after making sure everything was ready for services and so on. And his daughter was obviously of an age to marry, and Orlando took a shine to her. And that was that, and they lived happily ever after, until his untimely death. They were living in a road called the Wolf Staple in Westminster by 1609, a street just outside New Palace Yard, outside the Whitehall Palace. So he was close to work, he just had to cross the road, go through the gate into the palace, and there he was for most of the time that he was working. It's the road that now would have led to where the Westminster Bridge is, but the bridge didn't exist at the time. So he's established himself quite quickly. He's only 20, and he's already in the centre of things, and dealing with the day-to-day work of the Chapel Royal, and also the great occasions when the Chapel Royal was involved. One of the first of these would be the funeral of the young Prince Henry, who died at the age of 19, the Prince of Wales. As you probably know, he went swimming in the Thames inadvisedly and caught typhoid and died, and it was a huge tragedy. He was the great hope of England at that time. He was a multi-talented young man, very aware of the arts. He was a patron of the arts, even in his short lifetime, and would have done all sorts of interesting things had he lived. And of course, if he had lived, Charles would not have come to the throne, and we may never have had the Civil War, and the whole of English history would have been completely different, but we can't speculate about that. Anyway, he died in 1612, much to the court and the country's great shame and worry about the future. And his funeral in St James's Palace is quite well documented. The body was carried from the presence chamber of the palace to the chapel, with the gentlemen of His Majesty's Chapel singing mournful ditties. You don't know what mournful ditties, but you can imagine. Then the service took place. The gentlemen of the King's Chapel, with the children thereof, sang diverse anthems together with the organs and other wind instruments. Cornets and sackbuts were brought in. Sackbuts often associated with funereal music, and they're working together with the organs, plural, and all the singers. Each gentleman, which would include Orlando, received 4 yards of mourning livery, but then wore rich coats over their surplices. We don't have an illustration from that, but the gentlemen of the royal from Elizabeth's funeral in 1603 are depicted on the right there. You can see the rich coats covering their surplices. And So that would have been one of the first major events in Orlando Gibbons' Chapel Royal career, where he had possibly provided music and certainly was involved in performing. One of the pieces that might have been written for that, we don't know, is the penitential psalm setting, O Lord in thy wrath, 6-part piece, which is very suitable for a funeral. It's only in one source that dates from around 1625, copied by John Barnard. Here it is, or at least the beginning of it, performed by Oxford Camerata. A mournful ditty. Gibbons, although his job was in the Chapel Royal, would no doubt have known musicians who were working in the secular sphere within the court. And it was a very lively time in the first 20 years of the 17th century, primarily because of Queen Anne on the top right-hand corner there, James's Danish wife, who was full of fun and enjoyed particularly dancing and mask making and performance of masks. She sponsored many masks. Texts written by Ben Jonson, many of them, who had written dramas for the children of the Chapel Royal, so there's a connection between the sacred and the secular parts of the court life, and scenery and theatrical machines and so on, built by Inigo Jones, the great architect, inspired by Italian humanistic principles, who built eventually the banqueting house, the only part of Whitehall Palace of that period that survives, initially not only for banqueting but for the performance of masks. In fact, by Charles I's time, he was so fed up with all the wonderful decorations getting badly affected by the smoke from the candles that lit the masks, that he built a shed outside for the masks to take place in, and the banqueting house retained its original purpose of banqueting. Queen Anne was disgraceful in many cases. She upset people and she was a source of great scandal. The masks were attended by the wealthy, by ambassadors. It was a symbol of British wealth. It brought together drama, music, words, action, theatre. It was a musical of its time. It was equivalent to something that brings together everything and was extremely expensive to put on. On one occasion, in 1605, the Masque of Blackness was performed, music by Alfonso Ferrabosco the Younger. Anne herself danced. The masque was intended that the courtiers would take the principal roles of the main dancers, and then there was professional dancers who performed what were known as anti-masques, little episodes that went between the main dances, and the professional dancers used antic gestures and so on, whereas the courtiers danced more sophisticated courtly dances. But Queen Anne danced herself when she was 6 months pregnant, which really shocked the court. Not only that, but her costume revealed her lower leg and ankles. And this was noted at the time. One commentator says, the Queen and some dozen ladies, all painted like blackamoors, they're blacking up, face and neck bare, that's terrible, and for the rest strangely attired in barbaresque mantles to the half leg, having buskins all beset with jewels. You don't see the buskins in that picture, but they're on these raised platform heels, bejeweled. I mean, the cost of these costumes was exorbitant. This commentator says it took the king between £4,000 or £5,000 to execute the Queen's fancy. Between £4,000 or £5,000 is now the equivalent of about 1.3 million for one night stand. You know, we think Andrew Lloyd Webber's a millionaire, etc. He has to be to put on that sort of show. And this was money from the Exchequer going to Queen Anne's to satisfy her fancy. I fancy doing a Masque of Blackness, and I have 5,000 quid. Yes, dear, of course, dear. Whether Orlando Gibbons was directly involved in performing any of the masks, we have no documentary evidence, but he knew the people who were. And there is evidence in some of his music of mask dance-like features. In the summer, I did a version of this performance with some live performers, and they played a little extract from one of the four-part fantasies with Dougal bass, one of the little dance sections with written out repeats. And it does feel very like the sort of dance music that you come across in masking dances that have survived and remains that. So although Gibbons doesn't leave us any masked dance music per se, he was aware of it, and that style is underlies some of his music. So this is the atmosphere in which he was working, and the first publication comes at more or less just after Prince Henry's death. This is 1612. His first publication, one of very few publications. He didn't publish a lot of music, most of it survived in manuscript, but he joins the fervour of madrigals apt for voices and viols, or in this case, for viols and voices. Viols come first. Published in 1612 and dedicated to Sir Christopher Hatton. And those of us that went to Oxford in March for the meeting, Joe Wainwright was showing the original sets of part books that they possess, with the Hatton stag crest embossed on the front. And Joe's view was, and I think there's a little to go against that this is the presentation copy, the 5 part books embossed beautifully, which he would have given to Sir Christopher, the dedicatee. And they are beautiful examples of tooling and leatherwork. This was, as I say, part of a trend in the first 10 to 15 years of the 17th century. Thomas Wilkes started the trend in 1600, madrigals of 5 and 6 parts. John Wilby's second set in 1609, Bird's Songs and Sonnets of 1611, and Ward's 1613 first set of English madrigals. They're all described as apt for voices and violins, one way or another. The dedicatee Sir Christopher Hatton was an MP for Buckingham, Bedford and Huntingdon at various stages between 1601 and 1614, knighted in 1606, minor nobility, if you like, connected to the court through his wife Alice, whose brother was Sir Henry Fanshawe, one of Prince Henry's advisors, and so this is almost on the edge of court life from that point of view. The dedication mentions that the texts that Gibbons sets were chosen by Sir Christopher. That's the implication anyway. The dedication starts, as with many of these ones, with typical bits of humanistic thinking. It is proportion that beautifies everything. The whole universe consists of it, and music is measured by it. And then again, a commonality in these dedications, that the music will only be appreciated if it's performed well. Songs of this nature are usually esteemed as they are well or ill performed, which excellent grace I am sure your unequalled love unto music will not suffer them to want. So when Sir Christopher's around, his musicians will make sure they're well performed. They were most of them composed in your own house. The language they speak, you provided them. So the words were suggested perhaps by Sir Christopher, or collected by Sir Christopher. And composed in your own house, it sounds as though Gibbons is working as a house musician for the Hatton family, alongside his job at the Chapel Royal. They vary in nature tremendously, from very simple to quite complex. Many of you will know them. The Silver Swan, which opens the volume, is very straightforward, very simple. It's mostly homophonic with just little bits of imitation, setting the words very clearly, almost in a sort of reformed church style. And apt for voices or viols, or both, or any combination of the above. Here it's performed by Tessa Bonner, singing just the top part, with the other parts supplied by the Rose Consort. If you haven't performed these 5-part songs on your viols, you really ought to try them. There are 6-part fantasies, there's the 4-part pieces of double bass, there's sets of 3-part and 2-part pieces. There's some illuminates for 5 parts, but no fantasies for 5 parts. They're in this book. And they work really well, just as instrumental consorts, full of interest. The reason that they work much better than many other madrigals is that all the parts are of equal interest. And they're properly contrapuntal most of the time in some more complex works. And they're very good to play. So if you haven't tried that, do. And they must have done something like that at the time, because one of the manuscripts in Christchurch, Christchurch Mus 21, is a score book, which is associated with Gibbons, a lot of Gibbons music's in it, as well as music by Coprario. And the 5-part songs are all there in score. This is written in score. It's what's known as a stratigraphic score, so it goes across the top from left to right and then across the bottom from left to right. And all 5 are there, all the 5-part songs are there. None of them have any words at all. And 2 of them are called fantasies. One of them is called a fantasy by Ferrabosco, but it's a song by Gibbons. So the copyist wasn't entirely sure what some of these pieces were, I suspect, or somebody later put that, I don't know. Joe Wainwright's currently editing these and will be producing them from York University, what's it called, York University Early Music Press, with parts, hopefully, so that you may well have sets of parts of your own with the words, but you can now play them without the words, which will be interesting. And what's more interesting is that there are quite a lot of variants between the copies in Mus 21 and the printed 1612 copies. Bits where parts are being swapped around, there are different notes in 1 or 2 places, some of them miss a little section or have something additional different. So they weren't directly copied from the songbooks. The source of this manuscript must have been somewhere else. Joe's thought at the moment is that maybe these are early versions that someone got hold of, and Gibbons refined them before he published them in 1612. But I await Joe's editorial comments on that, but it'd be interesting to see what he comes up with. But alongside the 5-part pieces in Christchurch, Mus 21, are some of the 6-part fantasies, all the 3-part fantasies, and some of the verse anthems, as well as music by Italian madrigalists and Coprario's pieces. So an interesting source that shows what somebody was collecting together, probably in the 1620s. Moving on in his career, the next royal event was a happier one. This was the marriage of Elizabeth, James's daughter, to the Elector Palatine Frederick V. The 2 portraits don't match up in time. She's only 7 in the portrait. They were the same age, and so they were 13 plus 4. They were late teenagers when they got married. They were married in London and then went on honeymoon. They went off to Heidelberg, where his court was, and Elizabeth took a small group of courtiers and musicians with her, and it's highly likely that Orlando Gibbons was one of the musicians that she took with her. So they're sailing down the Bryan, stopping off, having parties, having music, and Gibbons would be there as part of the honeymoon troupe of musicians accompanying the young princely couple. The rest of her history wasn't that happy because the wars between Catholics and Protestants on the continent, eventually the 30 Years' War, ended up with Frederick being crowned Holy Roman Emperor for 1 year only and then being deposed and so on, which is why she got the nickname of the Winter Queen. Elizabeth only reigned for a year before going into exile. But relating back to Gibbons, one of the most important outcomes of this match was the collection of keyboard pieces, which was dedicated, Parthenia dedicated to the young couple and presented to them just before their wedding, before they then went off on this trip. And this was a collection of keyboard pieces by the 3 leading keyboard composers at court, or associated with the court: William Byrd, who retired, he was in his early 70s, John Bull, who was around 50, and Orlando Gibbons, who wasn't yet 30. So he's obviously working with these much more experienced, older keyboard writers, and was thought worthy enough to contribute to this piece. And one of the pieces that he contributes is the well-known Lord of Salisbury's Pavern, the Earl of Salisbury's Pavern, which Salisbury, Robert Cecil, had died the year before, 1612, so there's a sort of memorial pavern for Cecil. And it was the first, it proudly says on the title page, the first ever to be engraved music in England. It is engraved, as you probably tell, rather than being set, as vocal music was, set to type, so that each note came with its separate little block of type. One of the reasons for doing that for keyboard music is it's much more flexible to engrave it. If you've got every note on a little bit of type, you've got to have, you've got to find some way of making a chord out of lots of little bits. So to engrave it was much more straightforward, and it meant that you didn't have to take space between notes if they were moving quite quickly together. So you see those little written out trills on the top line. That would have taken an awful lot of space to put each one as a separate bit of type, but you can fit them in quite neatly there. It's a very graceful looking thing, isn't it? And quite easy to read, actually. So there were 21 pieces by Bird, 21 pieces altogether, 8 by Bird, 7 by Bull, 6 by Gibbons. And some of this keyboard music also works quite well for violins. If you're running out of things to play, you could arrange some dance music for violins. I know David's done some. Ibby's done a version of this for 4 viols. He's left out all the twiddly notes. So you get the real melody underlying it, which on a sustained stringed instrument makes more sense. Though maybe string players at that time would have used similar ornamentation. I think we're a bit wary of using ornamentation in our concert music, and perhaps they would have done more than we do. And so on. And there are other pieces that work equally well on viols, so that's worth thinking about. But I'm going to play you an example, the opening of this at least, performed not on a historical instrument, it's performed by Glenn Gould on the piano. Glenn Gould said about Gibbons' music, "Ever since my teenage years, this music has moved me more deeply than any other sound experience I can think of." Glenn Gould played a terrific range of music, played a lot of Bach, and he thinks Gibbons moves him more than that. Maybe that's just one of those things he said. But he recorded this in 1968, and it's in his idiosyncratic piano playing style. If you know Glenn Gould recordings, he does all sorts of rather strange things. He halves the time values of all the twiddles, so instead of going he goes and he spreads chords which you might not expect on the piano, but you might on a harpsichord, etc., etc. Anyway, here's Glenn Gould playing. So by 1613, he's not yet 30, Gibbons is right in the thick of London artistic life. He's living in Westminster, he's writing music for royalty, he's writing music in honour of senior courtiers, he's writing a wedding anthem for the Earl of Somerset, blessed are all they. He's writing anthems associated with texts written for him or written by senior clergy from the Royal Chaplaincy, Godfrey Goodman, William Lord, Anthony Maxey. He's got connections in all the high circles in London life. He's invited in 1614 to contribute to William Laken's Tears and Lamentations of a Sorrowful Soul, a collection of music by many different leading composers at the time. He's also reflecting London life in his own music. By writing sets of cries, the street cries, which many of you will know. Gibbons writes a pair of cries, both based on the in nomine theme. He does something that other composers don't do, which is not just to write a piece based on cries, but he says, I can write a set of cries that's based on an instrumental fantasy form known as the in nomine, and brings together both his sort of intellectual musical skills and his delight in being in London and hearing all these sounds around about him. Great pieces to try and perform. Going on with his career, largely in the Chapel Royal, which is his main employment, in 1613, senior organist John Bull departs because he's accused of adultery and it tries to escape penalties by leaving the country and goes and exiles himself in the Low Countries. Upon which the other two organists, Hooper and Gibbons, are each given a small increment of £3, 6 and 8 a year for taking on Bull's extra duties. Then in 1615, there's a payment by James I to Orlando Gibbons for £150. That's a lot of money, it's about 33,000 in our terms, for and in consideration of good and faithful service. What was that for? Who knows? There's no documentary evidence of whether it was for a particular thing that he'd done, whether it was for just being a good egg and looking after things when Bull was being silly. I don't know. It's a lot of money to be given, or was given to just a treasured member of the court music. And James wants to give him a clap on the back and say, thank you very much. His next job was to be part of the music making that attended James's visit to Scotland, the only time he went back to Scotland, having acceded to the English throne. In 1616, he wrote to the Scottish Parliament saying he had a salmon-like instinct to return to his native grounds. And this took place the following year when he went on progress, taking thousands of courtiers with him up through England, bankrupting everyone who he stayed with, up to Edinburgh. Gibbons was in charge of a newly built Thomas Dallam organ, which was transported not by road but by sea from London up to Leith, along with members of the Chapel Royal, so that he could establish the organ, get it all set up and working, and the choir trained for the time that James eventually made it into Edinburgh. Some of the London-based courtiers were not very pleased with this trip. One of them, Sir Anthony Weldon, writes, having got there, I do wonder that so brave a prince as King James should be born in such a stinking town as Edinburgh in lousy Scotland. Obviously haven't enjoyed the trip. And some of the local Puritans were not so interested in this elaborate liturgical life that James brought with him. One comment said, with this newly arrived organ, the organs came first, now the images, and ere long they shall have the mass too. Worried that James was going to bring Catholicism back to Puritan Edinburgh.
Is the money anything to do with the organ?
The money might have been to do with setting up the trip, but the earliest record of the trip happening was not until the year afterwards. So maybe he'd been talking to the court saying, I want to do this. I don't know. We can speculate. Gibbons began to accrue posts. His next post was for the new Prince of Wales, Charles, as one of his chamber musicians, a musician in ordinary. Charles had his own court, which was separate from James's court and Anne's court. They all had their separate establishments of people working for them. Gibbons was one of 17 musicians working for Prince Charles at another salary of £40 a year. So he's doubled his Chapel Royal salary by adding the second post. And it was reputed that Charles was a great bass viol player. Rather later, there's a reference from Playford saying, His late Sacred Majesty could play his part exactly well on the bass viol, especially those incomparable fancies of Mr. Coppeраrio to the organ. You know, the pieces for two bass viols and organ by Coppeраrio, possibly written by Coppeраrio to play with Charles, at least Charles clearly, according to this, had played them. Amongst Charles's regular musicians were Alfonso Ferrabosco the Younger, Thomas Ford, Robert Johnson, Thomas Lupo, and the Italian Angelo Natali, singer-songwriter, lute player, general musician. So he was working with a group of the top musicians in London at the time, in this role, not as a church musician, but as a chamber musician. And I suspect it's generally thought that Gibbons' role would be to play keyboards in chamber music with viols, violins, and other instruments that would be there. Virginals, rather than organ, because they'd be easily transportable. So if Charles wanted the music to move to another room, the violins and viols could move and pick up your virginals and go. And so it was an easily transportable body of musicians. I don't have any pictures of that Prince Charles playing the bass viol. We do, of course, have the image of that Prince Charles playing his cello. Do you remember that film about the royal family when he was at Trinity in Cambridge playing the Beethoven 5 in the orchestra and struggling to keep up with his part? And then he brings the cello home to show Prince Edward, and the string snaps and it's Edward, and he says, "Why did you do that?" Anyway, I doubt if King Charles still plays his cello, but there we have a royal bass string player. Possibly on the back of that role, Gibbons then picks up a third £40 a year job as one of the virginalists to His Majesty, to the King James, one of His Majesty's musicians for the virginals to attend in His Highness Privy Chamber. The Privy Chamber is the most private of the rooms in the sequence that leads towards the King's presence. Only the King's invited guests and closest advisors would be in the Privy Chamber, and they would be able to hear the music performed by Gibbons on the virginals, together with the string players of the private Privy Chamber music. We don't know exactly what sort of instruments Gibbons would have played, but these are two virginals that are in the V&A now. One, an Italian instrument dated 1594, and the other an English, rather later English instrument. Virginals was just a word for a portable keyboard instrument. So it could be a harpsichord, it could be a spinet, it could be a square thing, or it could be a polygonal one, varying types and sizes, but they're all just generically known as virginals. So as well as keyboard music, Gibbons is busy writing instrumental music, presumably for this group of sophisticated string players working for the various court musical establishments. And unusually published a set in around 1620, we don't know exactly when, which are the three-part fantasies. Again, cut in copper, engraved, the like not heretofore extant. Three-part books for the three parts, and again, Christchurch has two of these, I think. That's the treble part book, and you can see it doesn't look that dissimilar from type set music, but it is actually all engraved, and very easy to see the shapes of phrases, the rise and fall of them. These were dedicated to Edward Ray, who was a groom of the bedchamber, so another of Gibbons' colleagues in the group of servants working closely with the royal family. And again, these pieces have never really gone out of circulation, the three-part fantasies. There are many different manuscript sources from the time. They were reissued in print in 1648 in Amsterdam, and reappeared amongst the earliest of Gibbons' pieces to be re-edited and republished in the 19th century. In 1843, they were published by Edward, I don't know how you pronounce his name, it looks French, Rimbaud, or it could be Rimbaud, a member of the Royal Academy of Music in Stockholm and an organist of the Swiss Church in London. And he writes in his introduction to his publication, 1843 this is, remember, in judging the merit of the following compositions, we must bear in mind the infantine state of instrumental music at the period in which they were composed. You read these sorts of views very often in the 19th century. They're looking back from their day of Mendelssohn, Schubert, Schumann, later Brahms, and of course this early polyphony is puerile. It's the beginning of the road that leads to our great chamber music. Anyway, we must bear in mind the infantine state of instrumental music at the period in which they were composed and the limited powers of the instruments upon which they were performed. That they occasionally contain passages and combinations of harmony not quite agreeable to modern ears will not be denied. But I cannot agree with Dr. Burney, who pronounces Orlando Gibbons to have been, quote, utterly contemptible in his productions for instruments. See how tastes change, don't they? I mean, how often do you get together as a group and say, what should we play? Oh, let's do Gibbons. Especially the six of you. Let's do the Gibbons six part. And it's one of the top of the list for us. They were contemptible to Burney in the 18th century and not far off contemptible in the 19th century. Just because they were used to listening, in Burney's case, to Handel and Corelli, and in Rimbaud's time to Mendelssohn. What will they be saying about Gibbons in another 100 years? Who knows? But that's quite interesting. And I thought I'd play you the first of the three-part fantasies in a rather historic performance. This is 1958, and it's the Wensinger Vase of the Schola Cantorum Basel. So that's published around 1620. There's no date on it, but it's been worked out that it must be around 1620. The following year, Edmund Hooper, the senior organist of the Chapel Royal, died, and Gibbons becomes senior organist and has appointed his junior, Thomas Tompkins from Worcester, who's actually older than him, but Tompkins gets the job of second organist. Tompkins has been associated with the court most of his working life, but hadn't had a court appointment because of his job in Worcester, I think. Interesting, Gibbons is not just a refined thinker and writer, but he's also a very practical musician who gets his hands dirty doing things. 1622, he's one of a group of 5 court musicians who try to get a monopoly for the production of strings, instrument strings, so that the 5 of them can be the only people to import and sell them and make some profit out of it. That was not accepted. They lost their case. But interesting is he's trying to do these very practical things as well as writing and performing. In 1623, he's invited to contribute to the Hymns and Songs of the Church, a collection of new settings of pieces for performance in the Anglican Church, which the author, George Wither, his new translations, wants to have attached to every copy of the Holy Bible, wherever it is in whatever church. And of course, you know, the Bible is produced in many different formats, different sizes, different shapes. So he had to produce his hymns and songs of the church in many different formats, which is an editor's nightmare because they all contain different notes and they don't match up. But he invites Gibbons to set these to music, these new psalm settings, most of them. And in his dedication to the king, he comments that he's trying to make these texts more acceptable, more immediate to uneducated people in a way. I have also laboured to suit them to the nature of the subject and the common people's capacities without regard of catching the vain blasts of opinion. The same also hath been the aim of Master Orlando Gibbons, your Majesty's servant, and one of the gentlemen of your honourable chapel, in fitting them with tunes, for he hath chosen to make his music agreeable to the matter, to match the words, and what the common apprehension can best admit, rather than to the curious fancies of the time. So instead of writing elaborate music that would perhaps entertain and engage the educated audiences of the Chapel Royal, these are for ordinary people and are fairly straightforward. And what Gibbons does is write a tune for each one, and for most of them he adds a bass part. Any other parts would have to be improvised or added by a keyboard player, and modern editions tend to do these in 4 parts. So you've got soprano and bass there, they supply an alto and a tenor part in a sort of Gibbons-like style, but Gibbons only left us top and bottom. And again, these have had a long lifetime. Of the numbers that he contributed to this publication, 11 of them were reused by Vaughan Williams in the English Hymn Law in 1906. Gibbons tunes, Gibbons bass lines, Vaughan Williams tends to restore or to create his own harmony in some of the middle parts. But they've also had a long and consistent lifespan, though many of you may have sung them without realising. You sing in church, do you ever look at who the composer is? Sometimes it's there in small print. Composed by Orlando Gibbons. Oh, that's interesting. 1623, he gains his last job as organist of Westminster Abbey. Half the singing men in the Abbey were also in the Chapel Royal. They were all doubling up, trying to make a living out of lots of little jobs, because no one job would be provided enough. It's just like being a freelance musician today. You can't earn a decent living by being a member of one bar consort. You need to spread across several. So he adds the job of organist, and in 1624, the year after his appointment, there was a visit by the French ambassador and his entourage, who were taken to a service at the Abbey. And the record says, at their entrance, the organ was touched by the best finger of that age, Mr. Orlando Gibbons. The choirmen, vested in their rich coats, with their choristers, sang 3 several anthems, with most exquisite voices before them. So, to engage the French ambassador, they reel out the choir and Orlando Gibbons at Westminster Abbey, who were obviously doing a good job, or was that a piece of diplomacy written by a London courtier saying, "We're the best." You can hear the voice of Donald Trump saying, "Make London music great again." In 1625, the year after that record, again we have a very interesting little bit of Gibbons being the workman in the Abbey. He signed a bill for the repairs to the organ and sent it on to the finance department of the cathedral, of the Abbey, with a little handwritten note saying, "I know this bill to be very reasonable, for I have already cut him off 10 shillings. So Gibbons has beaten down the organ repairer by 10 shillings, saying, "That's not worth that. We'll get it paid if you take 10 shillings off." And so he says to the treasury, "You can pay this because I've checked it." This is 1625. Later that year, King James dies, and so he's involved in the funeral music. Again, he receives an allowance this time of 9 yards of blacks and 2 yards of blacks for his servant. He's got a servant. After lying in state at Denmark House in the Strand, the funeral happened in Westminster Abbey, included a 2-hour sermon by the Bishop of London, and one commentator said, "All was performed with great magnificence, but the order was very confused and disorderly." So they weren't as good at state ceremonial in 1625 as we are today, I suspect. And for this, Gibbons would be playing the organ, would be possibly directing the choir, may have composed pieces specifically for the service. And there is a great body of organ music by Gibbons, as well as the virginals music, which you may not be so aware of. And again, some of this would transcribe rather well for us. It's just the beginning of a fantasy for organ. There's no cadence. There's overlapping polyphony, it keeps weaving its way. It never quite sort of settles anywhere, so I'm sorry to have to chop him off. The time's moving on. So, 1625, James dies, Charles becomes king, and that was in March 1625. In May 1625, 2 months later, the court sets off to Canterbury, where Charles is waiting for his new bride, Henrietta, to come from France, coming into Dover, and they're going to celebrate their wedding. They have already been married by proxy earlier in May, but at the end of the May, the court, including the Chapel Royal and Orlando Gibbons, go down to Canterbury. Charles had to put on a good show because allegedly Henrietta Maria was going to bring 4,000 courtiers with her from France, and he had to put on a show. So, as senior organist, Orlando Gibbons went down to supervise music at Canterbury. He was suddenly taken ill, Gibbons, on Whitsunday, the 5th of June. And there's quite a lot of descriptions of this event because it was so sudden and unexpected. He's only 42, remember, Orlando Gibbons. He's in the prime of life. He's got all the plum jobs, organist of the Chapel Royal, organist of Westminster Abbey, privy musician to Charles in the chamber music and so on. Right at the top of his profession. He's 42, he's got a young family. He's suddenly taken ill and dies in Canterbury. Orlando Gibbons, the King's organist, coming from service at Christ Church, they're coming out of a service in the cathedral, fell down dead. The royal physicians were summoned because there was fear that he might have had the plague. The plague was raging in London at the time. Another comment says, touching the musician that died at Canterbury and was suggested to have the plague. So two of the royal physicians, Leonard Poe and Jacobean, wrote quite a detailed description of his final minutes. In the beginning, he was lethargical of a profound sleep, out of which we could never recover him, neither by inward nor outward medicines. And then instantly he fell in most strong and sharp convulsions, which did wring his mouth up to his ears, and his eyes were distorted, as though they would have been thrust out of his head. And then suddenly he lost both speech, sight, and hearing, and so grew apoplectical, and lost the whole motion of every part of his body, and so died. Post-mortem report shows that he had a catastrophic brain hemorrhage. So it wasn't the plague. That was the main reason these physicians were called in. They just wanted to count out the plague, so Charles wasn't likely to have suffered from anything. But clearly that brain hemorrhage was sudden, unexpected, and finished off Orlando Gibbons in the prime of his life. He was buried there and then in Canterbury, not brought back to London, just in case the physicians had got it wrong. And his wife Elizabeth paid quite a lot of money to have this rather nice bust carved. Yes, it cost £2, that's about £4,000 with modern inflation. With the inscription, Orlando Gibbons, organist of the Chapel Royal, rivalling by the stroke of his fingers the harmony of the spheres, a man of most upright character, whose personality vied, though most harmoniously, with his musicianship in charm. Deprived of life by a lamentable rush of blood and the cruel hand of fate, translated to the choir of heaven on Whitsunday in the year of our Lord's birth, 1625. And that, of course, is still there in Canterbury Cathedral if you want to have a little pilgrimage. What was his immediate legacy? Well, the first thing that he left was his son, Christopher, who was only 10 at the time of his death. Christopher was looked after by his uncle Edward, the older brother who brought up Orlando, took on the next generation and trained Christopher as a keyboard player and composer. It's quite likely that he went to Exeter and was brought up by his uncle. In 1660, at the restoration of Charles II, Chris Gibbons took back all his father's old jobs. They were restored to him. So he was organist of the Chapel Royal, Westminster Abbey, etc., etc. So in a way, the family tradition went on despite that break during the interregnum. And later, Christopher Gibbons lived in the same street in London as the Purcell family. They were close neighbours. And might he have taken the young Henry under his wing and said, come and look at these pieces of my dad's, they're quite good. Why did Purcell write fantasies and nominates in 1670s, 80s? No real need for them, but maybe they were inspired by Christopher and therefore Orlando Gibbons. The other interesting bit of legacy, just to round this off, is that portrait, which is now in the Oxford Music School collection, which was given to Oxford Music School by the composer and bar player John Hingston, some of whose music you may play. Hingston was brought up in York. He was a boy chorister in York Minster, and then went to work for the Clifford family at Skipton Castle. And Francis Clifford, the 4th Earl of Cumberland, sent Hingston down to London to learn keyboard with Orlando Gibbons. Hingston refers to Gibbons as my most honoured master. So he clearly learned from him. That was in 1621. And Hingston then stayed in London, or went back and worked for the Gifford family, ended up back in London, and worked for various people, including Oliver Cromwell. And then in 1660, he was appointed a viol player to the court of Charles II. And interestingly, the young Henry Purcell worked with Hingston. One of Hingston's jobs was maintaining all the instruments in the royal collection, the keyboard instruments in particular, going around making sure the organs were in tune, the harpsichords, etc. were working. And his apprentice was Henry Purcell, who went around with him. And Purcell got his job when Hingston died. So there's another connection between Gibbons via Hingston to Purcell. When Hingston died, he bequeathed the portrait to Oxford. He left £5 to Henry Purcell, his apprentice. To other people, he left a great Dougal bass. You know, we always think of Gibbons being the only person writing for Dougal bass specifically, but other people obviously had them. So he left a great Dougal bass. He left a bass viol in a leather case. He left 3 violins, these sorts of different people, a 2-manual organ, and my best chest of viols. Which makes you wonder how many chests of vials Hingston owned. You know, Alison thinks she's got 30 vials or something. That's nothing. So Hingston obviously very involved with viol playing and composing for viols and passing on what he'd learned from his honoured teacher, Orlando Gibbons, to Henry Purcell and so on. So just to conclude, what is the point of all these centenaries? You know, it was Bird and Wilkes, then it's been Gibbons this year, it's going to be Dowland next year. Is it Ferry Moscow the year after that? Yeah.
28.
28, who's it 27? Copperar, I don't know, there's always one, isn't there? And we hopefully sort of latch onto these things. And I sometimes wonder why, and whether, you know, yes, it throws a spotlight on them, but do we then say, all right, we've done Gibbons now, let's leave that for the next 20 years. In 1923, Gustav Holst addressed the Musical Association, now the Royal Musical Association, on the anniversaries of Bird and Wilkes, 1623. And a report of this meeting and this presentation were written up by Edmund Fellows, who commented that Holst raised the question as to whether the commemorations of this kind serve any good purpose. His answer was, this is good, this is 1923, that the English people are so slow to appreciate the work of their own musicians that unless centenaries are seized upon for occasions of special advertisement of this or that composer, his name, let alone his works, would remain in permanent neglect. That's only 100 years ago, and Holst was worried that if we didn't celebrate centenaries, no one would know anything about the composers or the music. Plus ça change. Or not. I don't know, maybe we're better at marking our early music composers. But I thought that was quite a nice note on which to round off a year of Gibbons centenaries. Thank you very much.